I at once sent a radio message to Rommel. General Ramka, with 700 men and all weapons, has been discovered by us. He himself is with me at the command post. Rommel replied that he had been very worried about the paratroops and had almost given them up. I was to have the general taken to him at once and to convey his men to him with available vehicles. I shall never forget the sight of Ramke's men coming toward us, exhausted, out of the desert. For reason of space, they had left everything behind except for weapons and water, but their morale was astonishing. In the morning of 8 November, Rommel appeared at my command post of the Egyptian-Libyan border and gave me a review of the general situation. The Africa Army had been in full retreat toward the Libyan border since 4 November. We were resisting the vigorous British advance with our last resources. The fuel that had been landed in Benghazi had come too late, or not even reached the German panzer divisions. As a result, some of the last tanks had to be blown up. At that moment, only 4 tanks were ready for action. The burden of defence was falling, therefore, mainly on the 88s. Rommel spoke of the terrible scenes that were taking place on the coastal road. Pursued by British tanks and covered inescapably by carpets of bombs, vehicles were left standing in flames, while the men tried to save themselves on foot. Owing to these insurmountable obstacles, the supply trucks were hardly able to make progress. Rommel's intention was to hold open the border passes into Libya and channel through them, erected by pickets of officers, the greater part of the Africa Army. I could see the profound disappointment in Rommel's face. Through Hitler's crazy order to hold out, we lost a vital day, which cost us losses that cannot be made good. I cannot hold Cyrenaica, so with the remains of the Africa Corps, under General Bayerlein, I shall cross southern Cyrenaica, despite the rains and the sandstorms, in order to set up a first line of defence at Mersa el Brega. I have information, Rommel continued, that the British, by means of reconnaissance detachments and scout cars, are trying to explore and prepare a southern outflanking of the whole Africa Corps. This is a deadly danger. So I'm going to send you the Voss Reconnaissance Group, Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 580 under Major Voss, and Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 33 under Major Linau. You will then be strong enough to prevent any outflanking. Rommel seemed unbroken. But one could not fail to notice how disillusioned he was at being left in the lurch in this way by the highest authority. What had become of Rommel's proud Africa Army? How depressing it must have been for him to have to give up in a matter of days all that had once been conquered in unprecedented operations. All of us now felt that we had to stand by our Rommel. Major Voss and Major Linau appeared with their battalions. The Panzer Reconnaissance Group of the Africa Army was formed under my command. From Voss, I heard more of the appalling events unfolding at the coast. It was terrible to have to see how the Italians and our own people hung in clusters on the few vehicles that were still intact, Voss reported. Some of the remaining tanks were on tow, as they were out of fuel. The supply vehicles could hardly make their way forward against the retreating Worst of all was the helplessness in face of the RAF, which covered the one asphalt road with bombs and machine gun fire, not only by day, but also by night. I divided up our operational territory so that it could be watched over without a break by our 3 battalions. Next day, Gauss sent us in addition a Fieseler Stork, that well-tried light aircraft for reconnaissance and communication, which was now to be very useful to us, since we had had to return the Italian Ghibli. My adjutant or I went up in the plane once or twice a day to gain a general view of the terrain, or of possible enemy movements. This saved fuel for our reconnaissance vehicles. On 5 November, the remains of the once proud Africa Army crossed the border into Libya in 10 days. On 13 November, our weary, decimated units reached Mersa el Brega. At the cost of terrible losses, 1,000 kilometers had been covered. The 21st Panzer Division had 4 tanks left. On the 8th of November, HQ informed me that the Americans had landed in Morocco and Algeria, and there was a danger that the Africa Army could be shut in on 2 sides. As a result, German Luftwaffe units landed in and around Tunis on the 9th of November, and paratroops on the Ilth. To follow were the 10th German Panzer Division and an Italian division. The 5th Panzer Army was formed. The news of the American landing alarmed us, although we were still a long way from Tunisia. There were rumors that the French, with a task force from Chad, were on the march through the desert in the direction of Tunisia, in order to cut us off in the south. Some days later, Rommel's HQ informed me that I was to be sent an Italian armoured reconnaissance battalion, the Nizza. At first, I was not very pleased, as I had no great opinion of Italian weapons or morale. They duly arrived, well spread out, and apparently still at normal fighting strength. Their commander, a tall, fair-haired major, presented himself. As he told me later, he had been given the posting for disciplinary reasons because of an affair with a member of the royal house. The officers and men came exclusively from the north. They were proud Piedmontese and Venetians. They wanted to show that they knew how to fight. May our patrols go on reconnaissance with yours? I was asked by the commander and his officers. That would be the best way for us to learn. I inspected their armoured cars and weapons. More sardine tins, said our men, who were standing around inquisitively. Indeed, the equipment did not even approach the standard of that which we had at the start of the Polish campaign.it, was hopelessly inferior to the British Humbers and anti-tank guns. And yet, the Italians wanted to be sent into action at the front. In the difficult weeks that followed, my feelings wavered between admiration and pity for these brave men, who, despite heavy losses, did not give up and so remained to the end, our good friends. We have, without doubt, often done our Italian allies an injustice. Frequently mocked by our men as spaghetti eaters, they were regarded, on account of their combat performance, as more of a burden than a help. We failed to consider that their weapons and armoured cars were far from corresponding to the standard of those which we or our opponents employed in North Africa. The Italians have a cheerful, amiable disposition. They are of a different mentality from us Germans. It is said of them that they work to live, whereas we are supposed to live to work. There is no doubt that the Italians are outstanding engineers, designers and road builders. They have given the world the most beautiful operas, and they are the best interpreters of classical music. The past culture of the Romans still marks these people today, and it has influenced all other modern cultures. Charm, gaiety, and a Mediterranean climate always exercise their fascination on visitors to their beautiful country. All these qualities and characteristics determine, therefore, the features of the Italian soldier. He does not take war with deadly seriousness, and ends it for his part when he considers it to be hopeless. Hitler's pathetic, cynical maxim, "The German soldier stands or dies," is to the Italian profoundly alien. It is against this background that the active service and performance of our allies is to be seen. So much more highly did we value the service of the Nizza battalion, whose officers and men fought bravely beside and with us to the bitter end. The lack of replacements of weapons, ammunition and fuel, the supply problem now had a catastrophic effect on the retreat. It was not only that many tanks and combat vehicles had to be towed back or blown up. At times, parts of the German Panzer Corps faced the attacks of the British tanks and the RAF with no fuel. Our reconnaissance battalion was greatly indebted to its supply officer. Time and again he managed to organize the fuel that was vital to us and deliver it to us through the desert in small convoys. Only once was a convoy caught between British lines and destroyed, as was reported to us by the accompanying radio car. For us that meant water rationing, half a litre of water per man per day, 4 or 10 days on end. Half a litre to drink without thinking of washing and shaving. This measure was necessary, since without water in the depths of the desert, we would have been hopeless. In spite of great privation, we endured the 10 days. From 6 November, my reconnaissance group at this time deep in the desert operated at first from the Djarbab oasis, which lay about 250 kilometers south of the coast. The stony desert here was not as flat as it was further north, where it permitted large-scale military operations. The further south we moved, the more mountainous the terrain became. In places, ridges with cliffs, scoured by the wind, ran from north to south, and thus formed an obstacle that could hardly be overcome. Then, further south, the sandy desert began, with its high, impassable dunes. Long-drawn wadis offered cover and thus protection against surprise attacks. By day, it was very hot, and at night, so cold that everyone was glad to have his coat and scarf on hand. Again and again, we were hit by sandstorms or deluges of rain. Contact with the enemy was resumed. We came upon our old friends, the Royal Dragoons and the Il Thete Hussars, with whom we had already been involved during our advance on Alamein. Although we knew we were covering and shielding the withdrawal of the Africa Army to the west, we had no feeling of being in right. We operated to all quarters of the compass, with the object of maintaining contact with the enemy and getting a clear idea of his intentions. Prisoners had to be taken in order to learn from them something of the enemy's plans. Our armoured patrols developed their net tactic in flat terrain, with a range of sight of more than 15 kilometres. Our very fast 8-wheelers formed a large circle, into which they lured the British Humbers and scout cars in order to close the net from two sides. This tactic usually worked, though we sometimes lost isolated scout cars through the more powerful cannons of the Humbers. The first prisoners were brought in to me. Some of them greeted File with "Glad to meet you again, Reckies." The British kept their sense of humour in all eventualities. After the usual small talk, we knew that the main job of the two British battalions was to prevent us from trying to interrupt Montgomery's supply routes by an attack from the depths of the desert. Much more interesting, however, was something a young officer said, which he regretted as soon as B had opened his mouth. The long-range desert group, under Major Sterling, had the task of finding a route for a whole British tank division through the mountainous country further to the south. From then on, the hunt for Sterling, as we called it, began. Sometimes we found vehicle tracks which could only have come from his scout cars. But time and again, this clever unit managed to evade our clutches. A couple of weeks later, a patrol succeeded in catching one of the long-range desert group's command cars, which had lost its way. In the vehicle, we captured a map on which was marked the exact route across a mountain range, by which a whole British tank division might have attempted a wide outflanking of our prepared positions on the coast. Thanks to this map, Rommel was able to save parts of the Afrika Korps from the threat of encirclement. In time, we got to know the names of the commanders of the two British reconnaissance battalions. Y2 was often addressed by prisoners. "You are Major von Luck. We would have been glad to catch you." While the Afrika Army was putting every effort into fighting an orderly withdrawal action on the coast, and then straight across Cyrenaica, we, with our 4 battalions, were able to operate freely for 3 weeks unmolested by tank and air attacks. We quickly developed a certain routine. Toward 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the reconnaissance patrols broke off their operations in order to reach base in good time. In the treeless desert with no landmarks, it was impossible to find one's way back to base in the dark. To avoid betraying our position, light signals were used only in an emergency. The two British battalions carried on in the same way, so that from 1700 hours, all reconnaissance and combat activity was suspended, to be resumed again the following morning, as soon as it was light. We could really agree to a ceasefire with the British from 1700 hours until the next morning, I said, more as a joke, to those around me. Why not? I was supported by Lieutenant Wenzel Ludecker, the reserve officer who had worked at the UFA film studios as an assistant director. After all, he went on, the British have a sense of humour. We ought to suggest it to them. Chance came to our aid. One evening, when all our patrols were back, I received a visit from my intelligence officer. "The Royal Dragoons are on the radio," he said, "and they would like to speak to you." "Hello, Royal Drags here. I know it's unusual to make radio on contact with you, but Lieutenant Smith and his scouting party have been missing since this evening. Is he with you? And if so, how are things with him and his men?" One of our patrols had indeed managed to take some prisoners. It turned out that they were Lieutenant Smith and his party. "Yes, he is with us. All of them are unhurt and send greetings to their family and friends." Then came the brainstorm. "Can we call you two, or the Hussars, if we have anyone missing?" "Sure, your calls are always welcome." It was only a matter of days before we had arrived at a gentleman's agreement. At 1700 hours, precisely, all hostilities would be suspended. We called it tea time. At 1705 hours, we would make open contact with the British to exchange news about prisoners, etc. In fact, from a distance of about 15 kilometres, we could often see the British get out their Primus stoves and make their tea. The agreement was kept by both sides until we were forced by events to give up the connection in Tunisia. The prisoners we took often had to stay with us for several days until the next supply convoy arrived and was able to take them away with it. We gave them whatever we could spare from our rations. One evening, when our radio stations had tuned in once again to the Belgrade transmitter, and we heard the song Lili Marleen, some of the prisoners joined in. "Over there we listen to Lili Marleen every evening," they said. "There's already an English version. Monty has strictly forbidden it, but we like the song and its sentimental words. The French and the Americans also listened to it, as we found out later. Somehow, it made things easier. Our 5 o'clock tea agreement had some remarkable consequences. One evening, a patrol came back with 2 men and a jeep captured in the desert. A tall, fair-haired young lieutenant and his driver were brought before me. The lieutenant was the snobbish, arrogant type of Englishman. Very correctly, he gave me his service number only, no other details. I tried to get into conversation with him and told him of my visits to London, of my friends, including a captain in the Grenadier Guards. He gradually thawed and turned out to be the nephew of one of the owners of Players Cigarettes. My officers made a whispered suggestion, and I had to laugh. "Lieutenant, what would you say to our swapping you and your driver for cigarettes? We were a bit short at the moment." "Good idea," he said. "How many cigarettes do you think you are worth? What should I suggest to your commander?" His answer came without hesitation. 1,000,000 cigarettes, that's 100,000 packets. My radio officer made contact with the Royal Dragoons, and I passed on our offer. "Please wait, we will come back to you at once," was the reply. Then, after a few minutes, "Sorry, we were a bit short ourselves, but we could offer 600,000 cigarettes. Come in, please." To my great astonishment, I received a flat refusal from the young lieutenant. "Not one cigarette less than 1,000,000, that's final," was his answer. So the young man had to pay for the high value he set on himself with captivity. A week later, shortly before dark, our doctor disappeared behind a rise for the indispensable spade trip. "Doctor," I called out to him, "do not go too far, it will soon be dark." He did not seem to hear me and went on. When he had not come back after half an hour, we began to be worried. The doctor was not only very popular, with his tropical experience, he was vital to us. We sent out some men and fired the prearranged light signals. The doctor remained missing. Had he lost his way, or had he been caught by the British? "Yes, we have got your doctor." He ran straight into our patrol on its way back. "This time, we have a suggestion. The Japanese have cut our communications with the Far East. We cannot get quinine anymore, and are suffering badly from malaria. Can we exchange your doctor for some of your synthetic atebrin? Come in, please." "Please wait," I replied. A moral issue now presented itself. Which was more important, to weaken the fighting strength of the British through malaria, or to get our doctor back? I quickly made up my mind. "Okay, we will do business. How many packets do you want for the doctor?" We agreed at once on a quantity that we could spare and arranged the exchange for the following morning. From either side, a jeep with a white flag drove between the lines for the ceremonial trade. An expensive spade trip. "Doctor, good to have you back." Rommel, to whom I related this on one of his visits, was understanding. "That's what I thought about the British. I'm glad you can practice this fair play here in the desert, on the coast. It's just a matter of survival." Only once was our agreement unintentionally broken. One evening, a patrol returned to base from its operation with a British supply truck. The leader of the patrol was a young lieutenant who had joined us from Germany only a short time before. "Major," he reported proudly, "the truck is full of corned beef and other tins, beer and cigarettes." "When and where did you capture it?" was my first question. It turned out that he had captured the truck towards 17:30 hours, hence after the agreed time. "Are you mad? You know the arrangement. This will not be the end of the matter." The lieutenant was astonished. "But these are things that are really useful to us, and which will be denied to the British. War is war." I had an idea of what would happen, and at once sent off a radio message to Rommel. "Have impression that British patrols intend to outflank us in the south. Suggest moving south." Rommel agreed, and sent word that another small unit would take over my position the following day. I briefed the leader of the unit on the situation in my area, and warned him expressly against British patrols, which would appear suddenly and try to take prisoners among us. In the afternoon, I moved south. What I had suspected promptly occurred. In the evening, towards 17:30 hours, a British detachment raided the unit, captured 2 trucks, and disappeared into the darkness. A gentleman's agreement was, after all, a gentleman's agreement. The end of our agreement came later, somewhere in the depths of the Tunisian desert. For some days, we had lost contact with the 2 British battalions. Then, an orderly came to my command car one evening. "There is a Bedouin here who wants to talk to you, Major." With a deep bow, the Bedouin came in. "Salam, I have a letter for you. I will wait for an answer." A Bedouin with a letter here, deep in the desert, where by rights no one could find us. The Bedouins always seemed to know where we were. I opened the letter. From C.O. Royal Dragoons. Dear Major von Luck, we have had other tasks, and so were unable to keep in touch with you. The war in Africa has been decided, I am glad to say, not in your favour. I should like therefore to thank you and all your people, in the name of my officers and men, for the fair play with which we have fought against each other on both sides. I and my battalion hope that all of you will come out of the war safe and sound, and that we may find the opportunity to meet again sometime in more favourable circumstances. With the greatest respect, I sat down at the table and wrote a similar note to the Royal Dragoons. Give this letter to the man from whom you received the one to me, I told the Bedouin. Say to him, many thanks, but don't betray where you found us. Heavy downpours of rain set in, which gave us time to consolidate the Mersa El Brett position. The deluges of rain were a hindrance, not only to us, but also to the 2 British battalions. We could not use the wadis, which gave us cover, for torrents of water, 3 feet deep, were carrying all before them. We were now stationed south of Agadir, not far from the border between Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. On 20 November, I was ordered to go in the Fieseler to Rommel, who for a short time had his HQ near an airfield. Rommel looked exhausted. His uniform was worn and dusty. The hard withdrawal actions, his deep disappointment, and his illness, not yet fully cured, had left their mark on him. He greeted me briefly. Instead of giving me fresh orders, for which I had flown to see him, Rommel took my arm. Come, we will go for a little walk. General Gauss nodded to me, as if pleased to be able to divert Rommel somewhat. We strolled along the edge of the airfield. I no longer know how to cope with the supply problem, Rommel began. A few days ago, an Italian destroyer with 500 tons of fuel turned west and unloaded at Tripoli instead of here in Benghazi. Kassering has now promised me fuel by airlift. The first 50 Ju-52s are on their way here. In the distance, we could hear the drone of engines, also, however, the rattle of anti-aircraft cannon. Out of the 50 machines, only 5 landed shortly afterward. The rest had been shot down over the sea. How could the British have known about them? We know today that it was Jean Howard and her friends in Bletchley Park at work. Rommel was extremely frustrated and stamped his feet. Luck, that's the end. We cannot even hold Tripolitania, but must fall back on Tunisia. There, in addition, we shall come upon the Americans, and possibly also the French, who are supposed to be marching with a combat group from Chad through the desert on southern Tunisia. What I was afraid of weeks ago will then occur, our proud Africa army, and the new divisions that have landed in northern Tunisia will be lost. First, the loss of Stalingrad, with 200,000 battle-tried men. Now we were losing Africa too, with elite divisions. I was much disturbed. Field Marshal, we still have a chance. The men are behind you, their morale is first class. If we can get sufficient supplies, we were bound to pull it off. Rommel smiled. I know, and I am proud of the men. But the supplies will not be forthcoming. Hitler's HQ has already written off this theatre of war. All he requires now is that the German soldier stands or dies. What we need is to create a German Dunkirk. That means flying out as many officers, men and specialists as possible to Sicily, while leaving the material behind. We need the men for the decisive struggle in Europe. How will you ever put that to Hitler? I asked. After consulting Kesselring and the Italians, I shall fly to Leitler at Rastenburg and make my opinion clear to him, beyond all doubt. My word still counts for something. I am still among the people and by my men. I don't believe anymore that we shall get what we need in further divisions, aircraft and supplies, in order to turn the wheel yet again. His face was lined, his shoulders drooping. He was the picture of dejection. Luck, the war is lost, he said. I was appalled. Was everything to have been in vain? We were still deep in Russia, I protested. Half Europe is occupied by us. Bitter though the loss of North Africa will be, we can carry on the fight in Europe and bring about a change of fortune. Luck, we have got to seek an armistice, precisely because we still have a lot of pawns in hand. If possible, an armistice with the Western Allies. We still have something to offer. This assumes, of course, that Hitler must be forced to abdicate, that we must give up the persecution of the Jews at once and make concessions to the Church. That may sound utopian, but it is the only way of avoiding further bloodshed and still more destruction in our cities. What had brought Rommel to this complete reversal in his attitude to Hitler and the war? Without doubt, his great disappointment at being left on his own, as well as the disregard for his ideas and the importance of this theatre of war. We walked back slowly to his HQ. Once again, Rommel took my arm. "Luck, one day you will think of my words. The threat to Europe and to our civilized world will come from the East. If the peoples of Europe fall to join forces to meet that threat, Western Europe will have lost. At the moment, I see only one warrior prepared to champion a united Europe." Churchill. I was deeply improper by Rommel's words. As General Gauss told me at the beginning of Memoir, Rommel had a decisive conference with Marshals Kesselring and Cavallero on 24 November. On 28 November, he flew to Rastenburg in East Prussia to see Hitler. The crucial meeting had the opposite effect of that for which Rommel had hoped. Hitler regarded Rommel as sick and run down, and his report on the situation as greatly exaggerated. He angrily refused to even consider evacuation of the Africa army. Round, and promised Goering maneuvered himself into the Voreg Hitler that he would give the war in North Africa the decisive turn with his Luftwaffe. Goering had been angry with Rommel ever since the latter had remarked that the Goering divisions and the Waffen-SS were merely Praetorian guards and should be incorporated in the army. Rommel went back to his men, although it was suggested that he should take treatment for his tropical disease. All he brought with him was empty promises of support. On 13 November, after all its stores and installations had been destroyed, Tobruk was taken by the British without a struggle. Much blood had been shed there on both sides during the previous 18 months. The retreat, through southern Cyrenaica, was a masterly achievement by Rommel. Except for a great deal of material, we suffered hardly any losses. The fuel problem had become increasingly critical. Of the 250 tons promised by air transport, only 60 bad arrived. With that, we could cover just 150 kilometers and had to avoid getting into any battles. Thankfully, the heavy rain that had set in also prevented the British from pursuing us. Italian destroyers with fuel on board turned west. The Africa Corps was again left standing without fuel. With the last reserves, we managed to bring the motorized panzer units behind the Mersa-el-Drega line. Rommel was reckoning on a strong flanking attack around the Salt Lake south of Mersa-el-Brega. I had to reconnoiter with greater intensity in this area. At the same time, my reconnaissance group was broken up. The 2 Voss and Linau battalions were sent north. Only the Nizza battalion remained with us. Gauss called us again. Through lack of fuel, we cannot engage in a battle with the British at or south of Mersa-el-Brega. Everything points to a strong British attack. From 6 December, the non-motorized German and Italian elements were moved to Tunisia, which was not easy, owing to shortage of petrol. The supply problem became ever more critical. Time and again, whole divisions or sections were left immobile. It was only thanks to great combat experience and outstanding morale that it was somehow contrived again and again to release them from encirclement as soon as some fuel could be organized. I had to give up the Fieseler stalk again. It was needed at HQ. I had to draw the net of patrols much tighter. Thank goodness our air reconnaissance to the south was intensified. In the course of it, we came to be attacked by our own fighters, who did not expect to find us so far south. During air attacks, everyone had to leave his vehicle and lie flat on the sand 20 to 30 yards away. The radio operator often stayed voluntarily at his post to send off our reports. Our aerial reconnaissance reported that to the south, a strong Coltim, probably a complete British tank division, was preparing to outflank the Nophilia position. On 17 December, I moved my battalion north, where, with other elements of the Africa Corps, we launched an attack in the flank of this division. Together, we were able to knock out 20 British tanks with our 88S, and for the time being, avert the danger. While the remains of the Africa Army were fighting for their lives on the coast and suffering constantly from shortage of fuel, we went back into the desert. The danger of a fresh attempt to outflank us remained too great. South of the Buerat line, we came across our British friends again, and the old ceremonial of the 5 o'clock agreement was resumed. But we also stumbled on the tracks of the long-range desert group, tracks that led to the west. General Gauss sent word that the British had apparently been forced to make a pause, since they had to reorganize their supply routes. But another outflanking attack was expected from the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Sterling. Our task, to reconnoitre more intensively as far as south of Homs Tripoli, with particular attention to an almost insurmountable north-south mountain range between Homs and Tripoli. One afternoon, shortly before Christmas, toward 4 o'clock, I decided to drive to a hill some 12 kilometers to the south, in the hope of getting a good view from there. Unthinkingly, I took a light armoured car without radio. I intended, after all, to be back by 5 o'clock. I ordered my driver to set off. I could detect nothing unusual and was setting off on the return journey, when I discovered, right between me and my battalion, a fairly large British patrol, which seemed to be settling there for the night. Fortunately, I was not spotted, and at once withdrew a little to the south, and then to the west. The terrain was difficult, and I needed time to distance myself from the British. Meanwhile, it was getting dark, and there was no chance of reaching my battalion. So there I was, with no radio, but at least with my compass. By the last light of day, I saw a wadi, in which I decided to hide for the night. As I came to the edge of it, I found a Bedouin family there with their camels and several tents. With a white cloth, I drove toward the Bedouins, who now all ran together, and made myself known as a German. In a gibberish of Italian and Arabic, I outlined my situation and asked for hospitality for the night. "Come, German, you are our guest. Nothing will happen to you, and tomorrow you will be guided back to your people safe and sound. We too are moving off tomorrow to the south, until you and the British have gone away." As always, the women stayed in the tents and risked only surreptitious glances at the strangers. The family elder led us to the fireplace, and we squatted round it. A low fire was maintained with camel's thorn wood, and over it hung 3 kettles from iron forks. The Arab tea ceremony then began. In one kettle, sugared water was boiled, in another boiling water was poured over the tea leaves, and in the third kettle, the tea and the sugared water were mixed. The procedure was repeated continuously until in the end, a strong, almost viscous tea was transferred to a pot. Little porcelain bowls in brass beakers were handed around, and the most astonishing part of the ceremony then took place. The family elder took the porcelain bowls in turn, held the spout of the teapot close over them, and as he poured, lifted the pot straight up, so that in the end, the stream of tea was flowing into the bowl from a height of over 3 feet without spilling a single drop. I was told later that in this way, the tea became mixed with air, bringing out its full aroma. It was said to be the pride of the Bedouins to be able to pour tea accurately into the little cups from the back of a camel. So there we sat together, the Bedouin family, my driver and I. Meanwhile, night had fallen, and the whole sky covered in stars. Among them, one could recognize the Southern Cross. We were enveloped in an uncanny, beneficent peace. Without saying much, the men in their bamouses sat round the glimmering fire, which turned their faces a ruddy brown. I suddenly had the feeling that we might have been sitting there thousands of years before, or thousands of years hence. So timeless did it seem to us. For a few hours, we wrapped ourselves in our coats. The night was cold. Shortly before dawn, the Bedouins struck their tents. The family elder came to say goodbye. "German, we are moving on now, to the next waterhole. You now travel on this camel track here for 3 hours, then you will find another track that branches off to the right. You travel on that for 5 hours till you come to a hill. From there, you will see your friends. The British will not see you. We wish you the blessing of Allah, that you may return safe and sound to your country." A handshake, and he moved off with his camels into the desert. I have never understood how the man knew our position and that of the British so accurately.